Kia ora tātou rauranga tira mā, nau mai hara mai, tēnei te mihi nui rātu ki a koutou. Tātai hia ko te kaua ki te rangi, takina ko te kaua ki te papa, ka tau hā whakatau, ko ngā wai e rere nei. Tēnei te mihi nui rā watu ki a koutou, ngā wai, ngā roto, ngā awa, e rere mai nei ki tēnei wāhanga kōrero. Kia ora whānau, welcome. Before I commence our kōrero, I just want to mihi tu Ngāti Whakauwe, he kitinga ki te ao, tēnā koutou katoa e tu Ngāti Whakauwe. Kia ora, my name is Troy Pata. I am your host this afternoon for our Wastewater Environmental Performance Standards webinar brought to you on behalf of Water Services Authority, e kia nei ko Taumata Arowai. I'm now going to hand over to one of our presenters, to John Kingi, just to introduce himself briefly.
Well, tēnā koe Troy, o tērā kia koutou. Ko John Kingi tēnei, hiri tēnei no Te Waka Tainui, no Ngā Puhi Ana Hoki. Kia ora, I'm John Kingi. I'm a Chief Advisor here at Taumata Arowai at the Water Services Authority, and I have been working across the iwi hapū engagement and around our treaty settlement obligations. And I'll be talking briefly through the start of the webinar before handing over to one of my colleagues, and I'll pass over to Michael Petherick, who can introduce himself. Kia ora, Michael.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Michael Petherick tōku ingoa. I'm Taumata Tiriti, and I'm the project lead for the Wastewater Standards Work Program. Good to see everyone.
Kia ora no. Hey, look, whānau, before we get into it, just a couple of housekeeping kōrero. So this session is being recorded, and for your information, if you require a copy of the session, we can email that to you. Same with the slide pack that you will see today. If you wish to have a copy of those, we will also email that to you. Nō reira, mihi mai, if you would like that, whakapā mai. You'll see that there's a Q&A section. If you have any pātai that arise during the discussions, please put those pātai into that Q&A section. There'll be 2 opportunities for you to have a kōrero, or for us to reply to your pātai. That will be midway through and right at the end. But it's very, very important that you get those pātai in early, please whānau, because if we don't have any in midway through, we're going to haere tonu and carry on to the next section. Ka pai. At the end, if we've got too many pātai and we're not able to get to you, what we will do is we'll have a record of what your pātai are, and we'll make sure that we take the opportunity to get back to you and respond by email or some other means. Okay, so kaua e wanga wanga. If we don't get to your pātai, we will get back to you. Probably the most important kōrero is, hey, we're in the consultation period now, and submissions need to be in by 5 p.m. Thursday, the 24th of April. Now, for those of you oldies who watch the chase, got to get them in before the chase starts on Thursday, 24th of April. Okay, I'll go and remind you about that, because it's a very, very important part to this webinar this afternoon. Without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to John. Tēnā koe, John.
Kia ora, Troy. O tērā kia koutou. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So I guess the first thing we want to cover off is why are we undertaking this work, and why are we doing it now? So one of the key, I guess, opportunities that we identified through this program of work is that around 60% of our public wastewater infrastructure will be requiring reconsenting over the next decade. So there's a significant, I guess, wave of reconsenting that we know is coming up, and we see an opportunity within that reconsenting need over the next 10 years to, I guess, implement and address some of the challenges that we know exist within the existing system. Of that 60% of plants, we also know that around 20% of those plants are currently operating on expired consents under Section 124, the Government Act of the RMA, sorry. So we are really clear that there is an urgent and real need within the existing system that we're trying to address through the implementation of standards. As an example, we're one plant that's been operating on a Section 124 for something like 23 or 24 years, a Wastewater plant. So these are some of the challenges that we currently see within the system that standards are seeking to address. Next slide, please. So what are the potential benefits and what are some of the areas that we're trying to balance? So the graphic here is a helpful one. It identifies sort of the three critical areas that we see as needing to be balanced within an approach, within the approach that we're proposing around wastewater standards. So the first is around a need to balance public and environmental health. So ensuring that the degradation or the impacts of wastewater discharges on the environment and people are mitigated as much as possible. Balancing that with cost and time efficiencies. So we know, and some of you may well know, that the existing resource consenting approach for wastewater treatment plants and their consents is quite costly and can take a significant period of time. The recent example of the Wastewater plant being a good example. So we're trying to achieve some cost and time efficiencies, whilst also enabling communities to still have a say, and for those local aspirations to also be balanced through transparent reporting and monitoring, and creating some consistency around consent conditions. So those are the broad three areas that the standards are trying to balance. Some of the potential benefits that we see through the setting of standards include the ability to improve public health and environmental outcomes by creating standards that set those treatment limits across those core contaminants. The inclusion of a discharge to land standard as well is an important element in the proposals as a viable alternative to discharge to water. And that's a key concern that we've heard from particularly iwi and hapū through our case studies, but also through some of the targeted engagement that we've undertaken to date, that discharge to water bodies is tapu, is not something that iwi and hapū support. And so there is a viable alternative proposed through our standards, and Michael will go more into what that looks like later. That ability for communities to have access to better information. So the proposals include a number of requirements around reporting and monitoring. So at the moment, resource consents are highly bespoke, and those reporting and monitoring requirements are highly variable. So that will be fixed. Those reporting and monitoring requirements will be fixed through our standards. The potential for reducing costs to communities and estimated savings through some of the case studies that we've also undertaken estimate that somewhere around 40% of the existing costs within the resource consenting system may be reduced through the implementation of standards. Lifting that performance element too to improve those environmental outcomes of existing plants as they go through reconsenting. And then finally around transparent monitoring and reporting around wastewater network overflows. So we know particularly for iwi and hapū, the overflow element of untreated wastewater into Te Taiao, to the Moana, to local river streams is a significant area of concern. So our standards are looking to bring in some clear and transparent monitoring requirements and reporting requirements relating to overflows. And we'll get into the detail of all of the proposals later when Michael takes over. Next slide, please. So just to give you a sense of the development process, so last year when we undertook to proceed with this program of work was really about identifying national and international best practice. We sought some initial technical advice on what existing approaches looked like or could look like. And we also undertook a range of work to understand iwi and hapū values. That advice then was presented to Taumata Arowai, the authority, and we went through a process following the receipt of that initial advice to refine and develop specific proposals which are now available for public consultation. A number of engagement activities and advisors were involved through that work. So we engaged with ministers and local government. We had to undertake regulatory impact assessment as well. Detailed technical advice, which we've also released through our consultation, was also provided. We established a technical review group, which included sector, industry, and representatives of our board and Māori advisory group. And through that process, we refined and developed the proposals further, and that has led to what we are now consulting on publicly. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about our iwi and hapū approach. And there were some different streams of work that we undertook because we know that wastewater and the impact of waiparu on the taiao and on communities is a significant area of interest to iwi Māori. So we had some different streams of work. The first was we undertook some targeted engagement regarding our treaty settlement obligations. And also some of the broader obligations or arrangements that may be in place under, for example, the Resource Management Act in relation to water services. We undertook some broader engagement, primarily through webinar sessions like this, where interested iwi and hapū representatives could come along and hear about the work. We've sought additional technical expertise from practitioners and from our Māori advisory group to ensure that through the development of the standards, we're getting really good advice from a range of perspectives. And now we're obviously undertaking public consultation, which provides further opportunities to submit and provide feedback on the proposals themselves. Next slide, please. So a really critical area of the work that we've undertaken has been around meeting our treaty settlement obligations. So the authority has some specific treaty settlement obligations that are imposed on us under the Water Services Act and the Taumata Arowai Regulator Act. Those specific settlement commitments are in the Waikato, Waipa and Whanganui catchments. And any decisions that a decision maker makes under those acts must respond to the specific treaty settlement arrangements and obligations that exist in those areas. So for the Waikato Waipa, that's Ture Whaimana and related interests and arrangements. And for the Whanganui catchment, that's Te Awa Tupua. We're undertaking ongoing engagement with River Iwi in those areas to understand how these standards may apply in those catchment areas, and that work is ongoing. We're also undertaking further analysis of all treaty settlement arrangements to understand if there are any other arrangements in other rohe that we need to be conscious of that may be impacted by the setting of standards. If there are arrangements in your rohe that we should be looking into, we would welcome your feedback through a submission or in the chat today on what those arrangements might be. Next slide, please. Just noting some of those other treaty settlement obligations. So there are iwi that we have identified who may have obligations or arrangements that stem out of, for example, the Resource Management Act. So iwi participation arrangements, customary marine title is another area that we're looking into. So as I mentioned, we're continuing to analyze the nature of these obligations, and proactive engagement is underway. So we've reached out to those groups that we've identified already. So if you are a group that we've reached out to, or you believe that there may be obligations in these areas, we're really open to further kōrero with you. Next slide. So just a little bit about the case studies that we've worked on, which are now available. So we undertook very early on in the development of the standards, we recognised that it was important to understand from iwi and hapū and local communities at place what their involvement has been in wastewater consenting arrangements across Aotearoa, and how we may be able to factor in or consider those key elements and insights through the development of our standards. We worked with Iwaitahi to identify some appropriate plants with a range of characteristics, size, discharge type, and location. And from that long list, we reached out to a number of groups and we landed on 6 case studies, which are available to read through our consultation documentation. Those case studies were at the Gisborne plant, Taipa, Porirua, Cambridge, Pukekohe, and Rotuiti Rotoma. Unfortunately, due to limited runaka capacity in Te Waipounamu, we did not have a Te Waipounamu case study included, but we're undertaking some ongoing engagement with Ngaitahu and runaka in Te Waipounamu to ensure that those South Island perspectives are also included in our mahi. It's important to note that we also engage with relevant territorial authorities and regional council staff in the development of those case studies. So they have a full 360 view of those arrangements. Next slide. And just to touch on, I suppose, how the standards are proposed to be established or framed. So there is currently a bill before Parliament, the Local Government Water Services Bill, which will make some substantive changes to how the wastewater standards are implemented and are applied. So wastewater standards can relate to a broad range of wastewater activities. Standards only apply to public wastewater networks, so they don't apply to private treatment plants or on-site systems. Standards have direct effect through resource consents, and Michael will touch later on how the standards will work in practice. And as I said previously, there are specific treaty settlement obligations which we have to consider. As I mentioned, standards are contingent on a number of proposed changes to the Water Services Act and the RMA, which are currently being considered in the Local Government Water Services Bill before the House. Importantly, as well, one of the key proposals being considered is that if a resource consent is granted and it meets standards, which it must, that consent will be issued for 35 years. That was quite a lot of talking from me. I think there are some pate, so I'll hand back to Troy.
Kia ora, John. Thank you very, very much for that. Just going to April Nordstrom's pātai. Kia ora, can you please clarify if these standards are going to be a new environmental monitoring standard under the RMA or a new mechanism?
Kia ora, April. And I think between Michael and I, we can tag team on these pātai. Do you want to pick this one up, Michael?
Sure can. Kia ora, April. So the best way of thinking of the wastewater environmental performance standards is they're pretty much like an NES, National Environmental Standard, made under the RMA. They're made under the Water Services Act. The bill that's in Parliament at the moment, the Local Government Water Services Bill, integrates the standards regime comprehensively in the Resource Management Act. So they are very much same look and feel, same scope and breadth as a national environmental standard under the RMA.
Apai. Kia ora. Going to Kate MacArthur's pātai. How will monitoring and reporting requirements be responsive to significant and or sensitive receiving environment values?
We'll probably get to that as we go through the standards. Each standard responds to those areas in different ways. So you'll probably have lots and lots of questions, Kate, coming out the other side of the discussion on the standards. So just watch that space.
Kia ora, Michael. Our next pātai. Kia ora. Have you consulted with or got advice from Māori planners or the New Zealand Planning Institute to consider how the standards might work in practice and get additional views on potential implications?
So we got advice from some really senior planners. Really important part of making sure the proposals were workable because they are a really significant and quite complex intervention into the existing planning regime. So got some really good advice from planners, tested stuff out thoroughly. And yes, we did have advice from some Māori planners or that brought a Māori perspective. They might have been Pākehā, but they were certainly looking at it from that perspective. And that has been something, particularly for the overflows standard, which we'll get to, was really important because that is a quite an important planning intervention.
Kia ora. And Davine has, I think this is more of a kōrero rather than a pātai. Everything needs to align with other discussions that are currently taking place across policies within councils, iwi deeds of settlements, for example, River and Freshwater Advisory Committee, also under RMA, Mana Whakahaere Ārohe. Thank you, Davine. Ka hoki mai anō Lara. Have you considered how these might fit into a mana whakahono ārohe agreement with iwi councils and how iwi could be best involved in planning and implementation of the standards?
Kia ora, Lara. Yes, we have looked into mana whakahono ārohe arrangements. There are currently only a small number that we've identified in existence at the moment. Importantly, the standards do not remove any obligations that councils, territorial authorities have under the Local Government Act to engage and work with iwi hapū at place. So our standards don't impact anything there. We are actively considering those arrangements, and we have reached out to relevant iwi who hold those arrangements to have further discussions as to how our standards are intended to operate and to discuss implications. So absolutely, we are considering that, but importantly, the role of councils around those arrangements is largely not being affected by our standards and the proposals within them.
Ka pai. Hey, look, we're going to take two more pātai and then we're going to carry on with the next section. I'm going to Maria Hoko Paura. How would these standards interact with statutory acknowledgements and the ability of regional councils to impose consent conditions to avoid, remedy or mitigate the effects on tangata whenua relationships with their awa wai whenua?
Kia ora, Maria. I guess two elements to your question. The first is around statutory acknowledgements. So the standards as proposed do fix the treatment limits and the requirements around the discharge types. So that will be set through the standards, and then obviously through the consenting process, councils will seek a consent, and that must meet the consent conditions as laid out in our standards. So we do need to make that element clear. However, around that broader tangata whenua relationship, as I said in the previous answer, the proposals do not remove any of those obligations that councils or regional councils have to engage and partner with iwi and hapū at place. You will still, or iwi and hapū will still need to work at place with councils to determine what type of discharge is best for them. And as I said earlier, the proposals do include a viable discharge to land option, which does give an alternative because we know to discharge to water, because we've heard very clearly that getting wastewater discharge out of the way is a top concern for many iwi and hapū across the motu.
Kia ora, John. Hey, look, Davine, just going to acknowledge your point e hoa. Te tauihu is not part of Ngai Tahu in Te Waipounamu. Therefore, if you are talking to iwi in Te Waipounamu, it is expected you will also speak to us in Te Tauihu. Tēnā koe, Davine. Hey, look, we're going to kick on with Michael for our next section, but please keep your pātai coming. We will get to them when we have the second section for pātai at the end.
Kia ora, and I can see there's a couple of questions in there about 35-year consents and a bit more about the NES, so I can touch on those on the way through. So what do the wastewater standards cover? So, like I said, so these, you need to think of these as being like a national environmental standard that's made under the Resource Management Act. They're made under the Water Services Act, but the standards are fully integrated into the Resource Management Act in the same way a national environmental standard is. They will have the same kind of scope and reach into things like regional plans, and they will have direct effects for new consents. So the first two standards are discharges to water and discharges to land. So these two standards deal with they are directed towards wastewater treatment plants, and they deal with the main discharge consents that you would expect the treatment plant to have if it is discharging to water or it's just discharging to land. The standard for beneficial reuse of biosolids. So this particular standard is based on a really long-standing Water New Zealand guideline around processing of sludge that comes out of a plant to a grade where it is safe to apply to land, taking that really long-standing guideline and making it as a national environmental standard. And then finally, overflows and bypasses. So national standards that sets some consistency around the consenting approach for overflows from networks and bypasses of plants based on a risk management framework. So we'll go through each of those in detail. You'd go to the next slide, thanks. So the discharge to water standard. So this is the standard that most people think about when they hear about wastewater environmental performance standards. So the way that this particular standard works, just going to kick off. So this particular standard, these standards are in place in many countries internationally. Some countries have had standards like this in place for about 30 or 40 years. Most of the countries that we would compare ourselves to have these standards, but we are really a very long way behind. They're end of pipe standards. So what they are intended to do is set requirements for the infrastructure for and the infrastructure is required to meet those standards at the end of the pipe. So the discharge to water standard, what that standard does is it sets 7 different categories of water body. So they are based on their sensitivity. So you have everything from an open ocean water body, then you've got a near coastal category, then you've got high dilution, medium dilution, low dilution, freshwater bodies, estuaries, which are very sensitive environments, and then the most sensitive environments, which are lakes. Then the standard will set treatment requirements if you identify which category of water body the plant is discharging to, and the standard will set treatment requirements for the main contaminants that are coming out of that plants and into the water body. Now, those treatment requirements, I really need to emphasize this, a lot of work has gone into what those treatment requirements are. So they are set at a level that is designed to protect the health of communities, public health, and to protect environmental outcomes. So they are set at a pretty high level, and they are based on quite a bit of work that we have done on what you would expect to see in modern treatment plant consents, what you would expect to see internationally, and also at a level that would improve the particularly the quality of our freshwater bodies. 75% of our freshwater bodies are significantly degraded in the places where our treatment plants are discharging to. So 75% of our water bodies are at poor quality in those areas. So the treatment requirements are set at a level that would improve, the plants would lift their weight and improve the quality of those water bodies. Consistent monitoring and reporting requirements, a really important part of the standard. So what happens out there at the moment is that monitoring and reporting requirements are set plant by plant. There are as many different monitoring and reporting requirements and compliance limits on plants as there are resource consents. They vary really widely. What happens? Monitoring is not transparent. It's very difficult to find out whether the plant in your area is complying with its consent. We know this because we, as the national level oversight body, can't find that out ourselves. Reporting requirements are pretty patchy, and there is usually not public reporting. It's actually very difficult, even under the local government official Information Act, to get information from councils about whether plants are complying with consents. And compliance limits. So compliance limits are all over the place at the moment. Most of them are phrased in a way that means that compliance, it's not possible for a regional council to take enforcement action. That is a long-standing situation. So you have a plant, it appears to be not complying with its consent, but it's impossible to take enforcement action. So by standardizing, monitoring, reporting, and compliance, the intention is to have complete transparency around how those plants are operating against the level of set in standards, and then to have really clear line of sight on what actions that regional councils are taking to ensure that there is compliance and take enforcement action. If that was the only thing that we did in terms of the discharge to water standard, that would be a very significant change to the current system. We are proposing a tailored discharge to water standard for small wastewater treatment plants. Now, half of our wastewater treatment plants serve populations of less than 1,000. So that is about 160, 170 plants serving populations of less than 1,000. Those are really small plants. They're usually oxidation ponds. They usually have a very, very small impact, very low impacts on the environment, particularly when compared to the significant impact that diffuse sources are having. So we're talking about here mainly runoff from farms. So those plants have a really, really low environmental impact generally. They are quite passive treatment processes. So, you know, they are oxidation ponds, and they usually don't require much operation in order to function. So there is a tailored requirement for those plants because they look and feel completely different to the big city and town plants. So the government is proposing that where a new consent is issued under the standards framework, a 35-year consent must be issued. The reason for that is because the councils need to have the certainty around the planning and the funding for the really significant upgrades that are required to plant infrastructure. So 60% of our plants are going to require upgrade in the next 10 years. 20% are running on expired consents. We have this is literally one of the largest infrastructure challenges facing the country. In order to fund that infrastructure and make it affordable for communities, the proposal is there will be a 35-year consent to provide that certainty around funding and planning. Finally, exceptions are proposed where standards wouldn't apply. Where there's an exception, the standard itself wouldn't apply, and the normal resource consenting process would continue to apply. Now, exceptions are intended to be an exception. They're not going to. They only pick up like 4 or 6% of the treatment plants. So exceptions, for example, are where there are really pristine. A plant is discharging to a really pristine water body. Generally, plants discharge low in the catchment, and that is where the water bodies are degraded. So, but if a plant is discharging high in the catchment and it's a pristine water body, the standards wouldn't apply, and you would get your treatment requirements set through the consenting process. Exceptions where there's a really low dilution water body. So about 30 plants discharge either to drainage ditches or to really small streams. That is historic. What is happening here is that the council is using a really small sensitive water body as a pipe. So the standards wouldn't apply in those situations, and the council would have to go through the normal resource consenting process. What we think that is going to do is it is going to drive the councils to getting that discharge out of that stream, out of that really sensitive low dilution water body, and into a water body that is more able to assimilate the capacity of it, or alternatively look at discharge to land under the discharge to land standard. Next slide, thanks. So this particular slide it is a pictorial representation of how the standards work. So if you look on the treatment wheel, so you go clockwise around it. So one is open ocean, that's your least sensitive receiving environment. So there is a technical report that's available on our website, and it sets out how those different categories are defined. Open ocean is about 500 meters out to sea or more than 10 meters deep, really high mixing environment, really high similar capacity saline environments. So then you move around the wheel, so you've got inshore coastal, high dilution, medium dilution, and low dilution freshwater environments, estuaries, which are highly sensitive environments where lots of people go and do things like collect shellfish, and then lakes. Now, as you go around that treatment wheel, the treatment requirements increase significantly from open ocean right through to lakes. And of course, the cost of treatment also increases as you go around the treatment wheel. Next slide, thanks. So this slide here sets out what the treatment limits are. Now, when a new consent is issued, the proposal is that these treatment limits would go into the consent. So what you are looking at is the treatment requirements for a plant. So on the left-hand side, we have the different contaminants that would be required in the consent, and so limits would be on those contaminants. These are the main contaminants that come out of a plant. So we've got BOD, total suspended solids, nitrogen and phosphorus, they're your two nutrients, ammonia. Ammonia is toxic to plants and aquatic plants and animals, E. coli and enterococci, the pathogen standard. And then if you look along the top, you will see going from, we've got our 4 freshwater bodies, and then we've got estuaries, low energy coastal, open ocean, the coastal water bodies. So just a few things about these treatment limits. So if you look at modern consents, you will see these contaminants are usually dealt with in most consents, but most consents do not actually place limits on these contaminants. Most consents will place a limit on 1 or 2 of these contaminants. The others are monitored, but there are no limits on them. So requiring limits on all of these contaminants is taking a really comprehensive approach to what is being treated coming out of a plant, and it is weighted in favour of ensuring that a plant is running really, really well, environmental outcomes are lifted. The E. coli, enterococci, the pathogen standards, so those are set at a recreational bathing level. So they are protective of recreational bathing for whatever water body the plant is discharging to. Now, if a plant is discharging to close to an area where there is shellfish gathering, that standard doesn't apply, and the council has to get a quantitative microbial risk assessment, which is a risk assessment for the impact of that plant on public health, and the QMRA would set the pathogen standard. So that has been deliberately done to protect mahi ngai practices. Slide, thanks. So I think John covered most of this, and I probably have covered bits and pieces as well. So really important for this government, the change that is proposed in the bill in Parliament is that regional councils can't require high or low levels of treatment for those contaminants. They would go into a consent, no discretion there. Standards would set the monitoring and reporting requirements nationally. That's a very big change to what we have at the moment. A lot more information going to communities about whether plants are complying with their treatment consent limits. They cover the most common contaminants. So if there are things like heavy metals that are being discharged from a plant, the limits on those would be set through the consenting process in the normal way. Really comprehensive guidance is being developed to support the implementation of the standard. Next slide, thanks. So a tailored approach for small wastewater treatment plants. So this is for those plants that are serving populations of 1,000 or less. It's really hard to count populations. So the proposal is to qualify for this, this standard. It applies to plants with an influent biological oxygen demand of 85 kilos a day. That's an annual mean or less. The proposal is that these plants wouldn't have any nutrient treatment requirements. They continue to have an ammonia treatment requirement, but no nutrient treatment requirements. And that's because these plants tend to have a very low impact on water bodies compared to the broader catchment that a few sources from things like farms We are consulting on whether there would be less stringent requirements for other parameters. So these are normally oxidation ponds. They have a cloudy waste stream, and that's because they have lots and lots of algae that is treating the wastewater. So that algae is naturally cloudy. So a lower total suspended solids standard proposed. Also consulting whether there should be a lower requirement for pathogen treatment if the plant is in a really isolated place, but that's open for submissions. And the last thing, and this is really important, these plants would be required to desludge regularly every 5 years. And if they don't do that, then there would be a breach of the consent. That's really important because at the moment, these plants nationally are effectively a contamination disaster, with many of them unsludged and a lot of contaminated sludge sitting out there in communities that councils don't know what to do with. The standard only applies to existing plants. So if there's a new plant, you have to apply to the general standard applies. If the population increases and you no longer qualify for the standard, then you would need to meet the general standard. So I'm just going to go quite quickly over the discharge to land standard, and then we'll stop for questions. So it was really, really important for us to develop this standard. And that is because we live in New Zealand. We know that discharge to land is something that our communities want. When there is engagement between a community and a council about wastewater treatment plant and where it's going to discharge to, councils will have a choice: discharge to water or discharge to land. If they choose discharge to land, this is the standard that would apply. So it is a consenting pathway for councils when they're engaging with their communities. This standard is intended to be really easy and practical for councils to use, and we hope that it unlocks discharge to land. So the proposal here is a site-specific risk assessment. So at a really early stage, a council looks, where is the plant, what pieces of land sitting around that plant might be suitable for a discharge scheme. They do a site-specific risk assessment. That tells the council, is the land suitable for discharge? What are the risks? Based on those risks, you get the treatment requirements for that discharge scheme. And so a council, way before it gets to the consenting stage, can know if land is suitable. They can know what the treatment requirements are. They can know the cost of that scheme. That doesn't change right through the consenting process, so the council can have certainty around implementing that scheme. And that is quite different to the current arrangements. So again, really standardized monitoring and reporting requirements and 35-year consents. So this slide just demonstrates how the process works. So we've got a baseline assessment. You assess the public health, environmental and social risks, an in-depth site assessment, and that gives you the site capability category and the risk category. So you get a class. And next slide, thanks. So the class determines what the loading rates are for discharge onto land. The other part of this standard is an operation and management manual, and we would be requiring that as part of the consent, issuing some really detailed guidance around that. So that requires things like monitoring of aquifers, monitoring of things like flooding or environmental events, to make sure that the scheme continues to be run in a way that is safe and does not poison water or land, because none of us are here for that. And again, so those treatment requirements, regional councils wouldn't have the ability to set higher or lower levels of treatments. There would be standardized monitoring and reporting requirements. They would be really transparent. So quite a big change from the current situation, and really detailed guidance developed to support implementation. So I think, Troy, might be a question stage.
Hey, look, we've still got some pātai that we haven't got to. Just want to let you know, whānau, if we don't get to your pātai today, we will respond to you by email. Just going back to Lara's, in addition to your case studies, which are great to see, thank you, your online consultation page says, find out how iwi Māori values have informed proposed standards. Will this information be made available?
Yes, I think I've responded to that with the comment as well. But for everyone's benefit, that document will be made available in the coming days.
Kia ora, John. Thank you. Next question, how can these be like an NES under the RMA if they are for a different purpose?
That is the way that the legislation works. So they are being fully integrated in the Resource Management Act. The standards will have the same effect as a national environmental standard. That's what they do.
Kia ora, Michael. Hey, look, we're going to take one more question because I'm mindful that we need to get through our slides, which is the main kaupapa for people turning up today. If consents will be 35 years, how will new settlements and agreement responsibilities be given effect to during that time frame post-consenting?
So by new settlements, I presume you mean settlements that haven't been agreed yet with the Crown, but are going to be agreed in future. So those settlements could be agreed, but pretty much in the same way now. So those consents would continue to be in place for that 35-year time frame.
Kia ora, Michael. Hey, look, let's continue, so we can get through our slides. Kapa.
Biosolid standards. So really quickly, so the biosolid standard is really intended to work in combination with that discharge to land standard. So what happens out there at the moment is that you get sludge that comes out of a wastewater treatment plant. Councils often don't know what to do with that sludge. It either sits in an oxidation pond for decades and contaminates the land. They become contaminated sites. They store it next to the plant in bags, and that results in a permanently contaminated site, or they take it to the tip, which is a really inappropriate place to take sludge. You need to have, for every unit of sludge, you need to have 7 units of rubbish. So taking your sludge to the tip means you actually need more rubbish. So it's a really, and also the tips tend to leach out into waterways. So it's a really inappropriate place to take it. Internationally, and in places like New Plymouth, you see biosolids schemes. So biosolids is required to be treated to a particular level, and then it can be applied safely to land. So that results in both appropriate discharge of the sludge biosolids to land in a way that is safe and much more appropriate, and also can be used as a way of earning income for the council, and they quite like that. So do we have a second slide on the biosolids, or we do? So actually kick on to the next one, that'd be great. So the way that the biosolids standard will work is if you have a stabilization grade for pathogens and a contaminant grade. If you get a grade for your pathogens and 1 grade for your contaminants, it would be a permitted activity to apply the biosolids to land. Now, the biosolids standards, the proposal is that the permitted activity would not apply for wāhi tapu or areas where food is grown. So really clear about that. So if you don't meet the pathogen grade, but you meet your contaminant grade, it would be a controlled activity. The council would have to issue a consent, but there would be conditions on that, things like withholding periods so the pathogens can break down. And then if you don't meet your pathogen and your contaminant grade, it's a restricted discretionary activity. So up to the council to control its application to land if it is a suitable thing to do. Overflows and bypasses, this really, really important standard for us to develop. What we see at the moment, and I don't need to tell you this, but we do need to tell councils. So all of our networks at the moment overflow. That's what they're designed to do. Most of them overflow really, really regularly because they are in poor condition. Many councils don't know what condition their networks are in, so they overflow really, really regularly. Notwithstanding that, in half of our regions, overflows are prohibited. In the other half, they are allowed, but consents are imposed on them in some way. So what that does, the intention with prohibiting overflows is to stop them, but it doesn't stop them. what it does, because those networks are in really poor condition, what it does is it drives monitoring and reporting and understanding of the network completely underground. The council will stop reporting overflows because they are prohibited. They are still happening. The communities are not informed of them, and the council is not incentivised to actually understand the network and invest in it. So in Auckland, what has happened, they have had many challenges with their overflows. So in Auckland, what they have done is that all existing overflow points require a consent, and a risk-based framework is imposed. So if you have overflows that are happening really regularly, there are really strict monitoring and reporting requirements around the overflow points. So direct reporting to communities, direct reporting to the regional council immediately, direct reporting to the public health unit. And what that has done in Auckland is required the council effectively to understand its network, to invest in it, to improve it. And they are getting on top of that really significant challenge. Bypasses for treatment plants. There are bypass arrangements for most of our plants, but they are not consented. They are treated as emergency activities, but they happen quite a lot. So what the result of that effectively is that their bypasses happen of the treatment plant. They're often in places that are quite sensitive. So, they can be in harbours, they can be quite close to the coast. Bypass will happen, and the community is not necessarily told. The regional council is not necessarily told. So the requirement would be that all bypasses have to have consents from this point forward. And again, there would be really clear monitoring and reporting around overflows. Finally, we're proposing that all network operators would have to have a risk management plan. That's a separate tool in our toolbox, and it's intended to complement this new arrangement. So moving to telemetric monitoring. So at the moment, most councils, they say, well, we only know an overflow happens if someone rings us up and tells us. That's literally what councils define as monitoring and reporting. So a lot of these things are never reported because they're happening all the time. People don't even know they're happening. So the proposal is that for all high risk overflow points, there would be telemetric monitoring. Bluetooth required monitoring would go straight to a computer, and then there would be reporting directly to the community at risk, communities of concern, regional council, and public health unit. All new overflow points would have to have telemetric monitoring. All pump stations would have to have telemetric monitoring, and all uncontrolled overflow points that happen regularly. So that's where overflows are popping out in places they shouldn't be. So that's the proposal there. How will the standards be implemented? So the stage one is developing the preferred option. So as John said, nothing in the Local Government Act changes. The council has to continue to engage with its community about what the options are for upgrade of a wastewater treatment plant. That could be moving the discharge to a more appropriate place, out of the estuary, for example, to open ocean, or it could be moving the discharge from water to land. It could also be around if a treatment plant is on hapū, and many of our treatment plants are in places that are highly inappropriate. So a discussion with the community about moving the treatment plant to a more appropriate place. Once that discussion is, what the standards do, I should add, is they set the treatment requirements for each of those options. So the council and the community know really clearly, if you're going to discharge to this place, this is what the treatment requirements are. If you're going to discharge to land, this is what the treatment requirements are, and this is what the cost is. So once the preferred option is selected, the council would lodge the consents, and the consent process would run pretty much in the normal way, but the treatment limits that are set out in the standard would be fixed for the entire process. So lodge consent application, notified if that's what the council chooses, decision made on the consent. Council builds the new infrastructure to meet the treatment requirements in the standard. Finally, compliance and monitoring. This looks quite different. Compliance and monitoring would be really regular. We're talking about monthly reporting for whether a plant is complying with its consent. That monthly reporting is public, and then an annual report that is comprehensive on whether the plant is complying with its consent, and that report would be audited. so publicly available to a community, to everybody. That's completely different than we have at the moment. Then you would expect the regional council to be enforcing really consistently standardised treatment conditions, standardised consent conditions, complete transparency around compliance action. Next slide, thanks. Exceptions to the standards. So I said there are exceptions, particularly for the discharge to water standard. So exceptions are necessary because there are some situations where the standards wouldn't be appropriate. So examples that we've talked about are really pristine water bodies where the waste stream overwhelms the small water body. Another example is where a discharge is close to a drinking water extraction point, and there are a few of those. In those situations, the standards don't apply, or a part of the standard doesn't apply, and you revert to the standard RMA processes. Transition arrangements. So really quickly, lots of 20% of our plants are operating on Section 124. The bill that's in Parliament proposes that council could withdraw that application and resubmit it to take account of standards. Another proposal that's in that bill is that if a consent is going to expire within 2 years of the bill passing, the expiry date would be extended for another 2 years, and that's so the council can understand what's in the standards and then submit its application based on the new standards. Finally, and this is really important, the discussion document proposes that there would be a limit on the time a plant can operate on an expired consent. At the moment, plants can operate on expired consents indefinitely. So the proposal is that there would only be a 2-year maximum that you could do that. Councils would be expected under a standards framework to understand their upgrade requirements, consult with their communities, get a new consent proactively rather than reactively. That time limit would take effect 5 years after the standards are made, so we can get through this huge backlog of consents that are out there. So really quickly, standards would be in place in August of 2025. From that point, they would apply to, so that at least the discharge to water and discharge to land standards would be in place at that stage. So new consents that were issued for wastewater treatment plants would be expected to comply with standards and the monitoring and reporting requirements as well. Does someone want to cover this particular slide off?
Kia ora, I think that's back to me. Hey, look, we're going to continue with our upcoming webinars e te whānau, and that's outlined in this slide. I just want to reiterate, if you wish to have a copy of this presentation, please request this. I'm going to go straight to consultation. So we're in the consultation period now, and as I mentioned at the beginning, it finishes Thursday, the 24th of April, at 5 p.m. So don't watch the chase. You must get your submission in beforehand. Contained within is also some links which will provide further information. We're not going to get to everyone's question or pātai whānau, so
I'm going to give it a good go though, eh?
you're going to give it a good go.
If you hang around.
But we will respond to your pātai, okay? Ka pai, if we don't get to it today. I see a number of our pātai have actually been answered through your kōrero that you've just recently completed, Michael. I will go to this pātai though. Do you have a definition for a pristine water body?
Yeah, so that is set out in the discussion document. Have a look at that. So it's where a water body meets all of the attribute A requirements that are set out in, I think it's appendixes 2A and 2B of the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management. It's about 6% of the water bodies in the country. Very few plants discharge to those really high quality water bodies, fortunately for us.
Ka pai. Hey, last question of the day by Kaiki Lara. You've cleaned up today with a couple. Some recent work showed that overflows in Tamaki are planned to continue in the Moana in culturally significant and sensitive areas. So under this, they will still be able to continue that for 35 years.
Look, so the council needs to engage with its community about where that discharge location is, whether it's appropriate. So these don't hardwire discharge in there. The council needs to continue to engage with its community about where that discharge location is. So we don't through the standards, we don't open the doors for councils to just hardwire and discharges wherever they feel like doing it.
Kia ora, Michael. Hey, look, whānau, that's all we've got for today.
Oh, we do have a bunch of questions in the Q&A.
Yes.
Did you see them?
Yeah, well, there's a heap of them.
Yeah. So
are you happy for us to go through them?
I can flick through them real quickly, if people are still on the call.
We can also send a link to the webinar so that people can access it later if they have to jump off and I think their part has been answered.
Hey, so April, you've asked how does the standards fit with the hierarchy of the RMA legislation? So that's sitting in the bill that's in Parliament. The standards do supersede all planning documents that are issued, national policy statements, regional plans, district plans. And so hopefully we've answered those questions around receiving environment sensitivity and the way that the treatment limits have been set. That's your question, Kate. Maria, yes, just want to acknowledge there isn't any ability for regional councils to impose more stringent requirements. That is the government's proposal. That is something that's been introduced by this government in the bill that's in Parliament, where the treatment limits are set. And that is the framework that we have been directed to operate under. Is there a presumption, Kate, that all discharges should be granted in some form? No. Again, so councils have to continue to engage with their communities about where the appropriate discharge place is. Alongside that, regional councils can continue to do things like prohibit discharges in particular places that are inappropriate. If a discharge is in a place that is allowed and a consent is in a place that's allowed, then the standards will set the treatment limits. Maria, how have cultural values and relationships with the Moana open oceans been considered in determining its sensitivity? So what we have done is we have looked at consents that have been issued recently in the open ocean. So they consents for places like Tahuna in Dunedin, Moore Point here in Wellington, Heretaunga in Hastings. So the treatment requirements reflect what you would expect to see in those consents. So there is quality treatment. I need to emphasize that it is quality treatment that in each of those places that I have named has made a really significant impact on the health of the sea there. Lawyer's Head is just a completely different place in Dunedin. Moore Points, Lower Bay here in Wellington. People are now gathering power at that place, and that was not possible before. You couldn't even go into the water. So the standards are set at a level that will really a fundamental step change to water quality if discharges to open ocean. Kate, no consultation has been done with New Zealand Freshwater Science Society. So we have been engaging with lead technical advisors who deal with wastewater arrangements and really good engagement with a technical advisory group. So no, we haven't engaged directly with the New Zealand Freshwater Science Society. The consultation is an open public consultation though. So I look forward to their submission. Daveen, in terms of receiving environments, is there any monitoring undertaken that would inform? So it is, Daveen, so yes, it is possible in a consent to continue to set receiving environment monitoring. So that is still a possibility. So what to set that as part of a consent. So you can have a plant in a particular place and there can be monitoring the receiving environment around it to understand the impact of the plant. Another thing I would say is that these treatment limits go into a consent. A plant always has to overperform. If it's complying with its consent, it always has to overperform. So these are the minimum requirements that a council would have to meet to comply with its consent. But if monitoring is happening in the receiving environment and indicates there's an impact, the territorial authority would you would expect the territorial authority to be addressing that as part of its plant operation.
Also,
that's pretty normal.
just to add to that as well, if you have a look at our case studies, there are some really interesting monitoring and reporting approaches informed by some Mātauranga Māori perspectives. So really recommend having a look in there. But also importantly, monitoring and reporting is more often than not influenced by local mātauranga iwi, mātauranga hapū. So it's important that, I guess, those local approaches are still able to be weaved in at place, rather than being set nationally per se, embedded within. But we've certainly looked at arrangements that have been informed by iwi hapū perspectives, and yeah, go have a look at the case study report. There's some really interesting stuff in there.
Okay, April, you've got a question. The standards are challenging when you compare it to regional plans. Most set limits after reasonable mixing has occurred. So I'm just going to put this back to you as a bit of a challenge, right? So these standards are end of pipe. That is because what they require from a plant is to be operated in a way that meets its treatment requirements. So they look straight back to the plant and its operation. So if there is monitoring or limits set in the receiving environment after reasonable mixing has occurred, so those kind of, you see those arrangements in place, but it is open to the plant operator to say, well, the E. coli has gone up because something else, there's a cow that's died further up the catchment, or the nitrogen has gone up because there's been a flood and there's been a farm runoff. So what happens at the moment is the plant operator always has a reason for non-compliance. They can just argue their way out of it. So the end of pipe standards are deliberately imposed internationally to require plants to comply with their consents. It is not an easy option. It is intended to result in better environmental outcomes. Maria, if a territorial authority currently treats wastewater to a higher standard, how would this work under the new regime? So a couple of things here. So yes, firstly, the treatment limits that would go into a consent are what we put up in that table. So that would be what is in a consent. Now, if a plant is operating to a higher level, plants always have to overperform against treatment limits in a consent if they're going to comply. So you would expect, if there is higher levels of treatment, many communities and their councils you would expect to see that continuing. Another thing I would say is we have looked comprehensively at consents across treatment plants. Most treatment plants have monitoring requirements, but they have very few limits placed on them. So most plants don't have like 6 treatment limits imposed on them. They only have 1 or 2. You look at all of Taranaki, they actually only have 2 limits in their treatment for their treatment plants. So the other part of this, of course, is plants don't comply with their consents all the time. That's really, really normal. So we do hear what happens if the territorial authority is currently treating to a higher standard. So we just want to leave in that with a little bit of realism about what is actually happening. Most plants are not required to meet a comprehensive suite of treatment limits, and most plants are non-compliant on a regular basis and no action is taken. Kate, how will the end of pipe standards interact with Section 107 requirements to avoid adverse effects on aquatic life? So that I just need to emphasize this again, Kate, the treatment limits that are being proposed here are treatment limits that will result in good environmental outcomes. They are not going to poison water. They are set at a level that would be an uplift for most plants out there. The bill in Parliament says that if wastewater standards are in place, Section 107 doesn't apply. And that is not an open ticket to councils to poison water with their treatment plants. The standards that are being proposed are set at a level that will protect environmental outcomes and result in significantly better treatment of wastewater than we see currently. Maria, if it says not applicable in the table, is the regional council able to impose a condition? No, if it's not applicable in that discharge to water table, that means that there is no, that particular contaminants treatment limit doesn't apply for that. So you would have seen that for the open ocean discharge limits. So for example, there is no nutrient limits proposed for open ocean. And that is because the open ocean is nitrogen and phosphorus rich. So nitrogen and phosphorus treatment is normally not required for those really open ocean plants. Similarly, total suspended solids from memory is not required for open ocean treatment because that pipe is 500 meters out. If the waste stream is a bit cloudy, that's not considered a concern. What is required though is pathogen treatments. That's one of the key requirements, so that people who are using that water, in that ocean water body, are not going to get sick. Kate, you have asked particulate organic matter. I'm not sure what that's about, so I'm just going to move on quickly because Troy's giving me the elbow.
No, not at all.
He's
Haere tonu.
He's not giving me the elbow.
You're on fire.
He must have been giving me something else. So I think if a territorial authority has a discharge, Maria, that is better than the limit in the standard, is it a breach of the standards? No. If you are doing better than the standard, best of luck to you. That's what we expect from now on. We expect all plants to be doing better than the standard because they should be complying with their consents. Kate, you guys are on fire here as well. Do the pathogen standards take account of contact and immersive uses of all water bodies by monofenema throughout the year? Yes. So what I encourage you to do is look at the technical report that is sitting on our website for the discharge to water standard. So the pathogen standard was a back calculation from a microbiological guidance that has been issued by the Ministry for the Environment. That is contact recreational pathogen requirements. And so the technicians, they back calculated, because it's a receiving environment requirement, they back calculated it for the end of pipe. And they did it in a way that was for the median annual low flow of a water body. So that was a conservative approach. And they also calculated it for the median weekly flow from the plant. They have taken it as a really conservative pathogen standard that is intended to be a recreational contact standard for all plants. Many plants don't have recreational contact requirements for treatment of pathogens at the moment, so that is actually a significant uplift that we are seeking feedback on. Will the consent still be granted? April asks if the water body is mapped as a site area of significance to tangata whenua. So like we talked about just before, so if in the regional plan, and a water body is identified as being inappropriate for discharge, that would continue to apply. So if a consent is prohibited to a particular area, you couldn't have discharge to that area. If it's a restricted discretionary activity, it would be discretionary as to whether or not the consent would be granted for that water body. So that is still something that the regional councils would continue to have responsibility for. I hope that answers your question. If standards are not complied with, will they be granted with a conditional, temporary or shorter term consents? So what is proposed here, Lara, is that 35-year consent, there could be a period of time, and you see this in consents quite a bit, a period of time where a council has to upgrade its plant to meet the standard, to meet the terms of its consent. So sometimes councils can't do it straight away, so they'd be given a period of time to upgrade, but there'll be a limit set on that, say a maximum of 5 years. So we are moving away from these short-term bridging consents. I want to give you an example. Cambridge. Okay, Cambridge has just been reconsented, fantastic outcome for the community there, great treatment outcomes. That plant was non-compliant for 25 years, significantly non-compliant for 25 years. They had 2 bridging consents for that plant, and before they have got to the point now where they have their full consent, $12 million was spent just on consenting those short-term bridging consents for that plant. $12 million that could not be spent on the infrastructure itself. So we are moving away from that arrangement. What we hope with good treatment limits is that is actually a really good thing for communities who are engaging with councils. We hope that is actually, rather than having to engage with councils for a couple of decades to get what is wanted, we can move to that much quicker. I think, Lara, I will have answered your question about overflows. Overflows in Tamaki are planned to continue into the moana and culturally significant sensitive areas. So no, there's, so the overflows standard, yes, it says, yes, if there is a discharge into overflow discharge, it would need to have a consent. That's the approach that's been taken in Tamaki Makaurau. But what is happening, because monitoring and reporting requirements are imposed for those discharges, if they're happening in places that are inappropriate, the community finds out about them and they demand that they stop. And that in Tamaki Makaurau, that is what we are seeing, is that the council is reducing the frequency of overflows. Lara, I think we've answered your question about pristine water bodies. And April's got the same one, so hopefully
I think you've pretty much nailed them all,
smashing it out. Kate wants a copy of the webinar. It's going like hotcakes. That's great. And Kate, you said you're not suggesting discharges of poison in the water. The ecology between water chemistry and communities is highly uncertain. Positive outcomes can't be guaranteed from water chemistry alone. So I just need to emphasize, so the discharge to water standard sets treatment limits for the main contaminants that come out of plants, and they are what you expect to see internationally. They are based on really good science and really good technical advice, and they are more comprehensive than what is happening with plants at the moment. And Maria, will regional councils always retain the ability to set activity status for discharges? So actually, the bill that's in Parliament, Maria, would give the government the power to set activity status for discharges from plants. That is not proposed at the moment, but that power is in there. That is similar to what would happen if there was a national environmental standard made under the Resource Management Act. So that lever is not being pulled at the moment. That consent is being left with the regional councils. And will the overflow and bypass scenario likely to creep into other activities? So that is that is ultimately a decision for government, right? And at the moment, that is not proposed. And I think we've done them all.
I think you have. If you hadn't guessed, Koenei Tana Tino Kai, this is his favourite kai, this wastewater kōrero. And today, you can see Michael is absolutely starving. So, hey, look, before we close up, I just want to mihi to everybody who have turned up today to share this wahanga kōrero with us. We hope you've received as much information as you can. If you still have pātai, by all means, send those pātai to us. My last kōrero is submissions need to be in by 5 p.m. on Thursday. the 24th of April, before the chase starts, ne? E rungi I tēnā, me mihi ka tika awau ki aku hoa mātauranga, aku hoa tino mātauranga mō tēnei kaupapa, no reira, māku I whakakapi I tā tātou nei hui. Ki te unuhia te rito o te haraki, ki kaihia te komako eko, ki mai he aha te mea nui o tēnei ao, māku e ki atu, he tangata, he tangata, he tangata. No reira, I rungi I tēnā koutou, thank you very much e hoama. Ka kite anō.
Thanks for your great questions. Send them through to our email address.